From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. When Mohamed Al-Fayed died in 2023, the tributes poured in.
Flamboyantly charismatic and famously controversial, he was the billionaire businessman from Egypt with a ruthless reputation and an obsession with British royalty.
Mohamed Al-Fayed, who went from selling soft drinks in Egypt to owning Harrods and the Paris Ritz, has died at the age of 94. His eldest son, Dodi, was killed alongside Princess Diana in a car crash in Paris 26 years ago.
He was a tremendous life force. He was obviously controversial, but I feel that he did more good in this world than all his critics combined. And the people who worked for him and the people who were his customers and the fans of his football club, they know the real Mohamed, and they cherished his friendship and they cherished what he did.
Well, we now know there was much, much more to the story. Many of the people who worked for him were scarred by the encounter, because for years, the owner of Harrods was abusing and raping women who worked for him. And just a warning, this episode will contain difficult descriptions of his behaviour.
When he saw someone on the sales floor that he was attracted to, largely on the perfume counter, he'd bring them up into his office as PAs. And he had a line of these very pretty women in his office. He said to the first one, "Crawl on the floor like a donkey. I want you to crawl around on the floor like a donkey, braying." So the woman dropped to her knees, crawled around, braying. And he was kicking out at her and shouting, bray louder, and laughing hysterically. He was finding it enormously funny to humiliate in this way. And then he started throwing notes onto the ground and made her pick them up in her mouth. And then she stood up and he sort of couldn't contain himself for laughing. And they all stood there looking terrified. And he turned to Philippa and said, "Who shall I get to do it next?"
That took place in the boardroom at Harrods, one of the most famous department stores in the world. Mohamed Al-Fayed used his power to abuse and rape women, to threaten them, to silence them, and to bury police investigations. Even his riches were built on lies.
Moving to London, he sought high society and aspirational assets, buying Harrods, a British institution. It was a deal so disputed, the government investigated and found he'd lied about his wealth.
And yet, he was never prosecuted. The story today, the Monster of Harrods.
My name's Alison Kervin, and I've written a book called Monster of Harrods about Mohamed Al-Fayed and his reign at the Knightsbridge store.
Alison, you are an award-winning writer. You've written some amazing books. You've now focused in on Mohamed Al-Fayed. Just give us a sense of, in order to write this book, how did you have to go about it? How many people were you speaking to?
I spoke to, in total probably 100, I don't know. But in terms of victims, probably around about 50. And the biggest mission really was to find these people and persuade them that they were safe to talk about what happened to them and that there was a power in them all speaking out.
For a lot of people, they'll remember Mohamed Al-Fayed as a huge character who sort of appeared on the stage almost fully formed, out of nowhere in the middle of the 80s. And yet by then he suddenly owned the House of Fraser Group, which included Harrods, the Ritz in Paris, 40 flats in Mayfair, villa in Paris, a castle in Scotland. Where does his story begin? Where did he get all the wealth from?
Well, he came from quite humble backgrounds. His father was a school teacher who went on to become a school inspector, and his mother died when he was very young. There wasn't a great deal of money around by any means, and he started off by selling Coca-Cola on the streets until he met a friend of a school friend who was Adnan Khashoggi, who we know best in this country as an arms dealer. But back then he was a friend staying with a friend of Fayed's, and Fayed went to work for him. And it's the most astonishing story, really, in so many respects, because when he went to work for him, the family looked after him enormously well and promoted him and gave him all sorts of shares in the various businesses they had. But still, when he left, they discovered that money was missing. And then he fled and went to the next job, and in a different country. He would flee and go to another country, and there he would establish himself. And then when he left, money had gone missing. So he did accumulate money. And certainly when it comes to the purchase of Harrods, that was money he didn't have. He needed sort of 500 or 600 million, and by all accounts had 20 million in his account. So by shuffling money around that he was purportedly looking after for various billionaires, he gave the pretense of having the money to buy it. And, you know, every part of this story is astonishing in its own way. And he kept getting away with it. He developed a lot of enemies along the way. I mean, a lot of people seriously upset with him, but seemed to just slide along without letting it bother him.
And off the back of these, as you say, nefarious methods, he manages to buy Harrods. Just remind us what he did with it. I mean, he wasn't one for subtlety.
No, he changed the store that had become successful and have a worldwide reputation for its subtlety and elegance and understated sort of beauty. And then he came in, and I think overnight he wanted to change it so dramatically, without, I don't think, a really clear picture of what he wanted.
Harrods, I always say, is my pyramid. Its history is one of the greatest architecture building as a department store in the world. I fall in love with it when I was 14 years old. And then bringing an Egyptian like me, who put again his Egyptian touch and bring his history, his civilization in a place like that. When I do something, I do it with passion.
I mean, I think he had a rough idea of what he wanted, but the changes they were going through, constantly moving things that he told them to move them back again, changing things. And then obviously there was the very grand escalator, the Egyptian escalator with the pharaohs, and there was the Egyptian room. There was the mausoleum for himself that he said he needed to be buried in so that people could come and see him. I mean, the self-aggrandizement.
A part of everyone's shopping experience.
Everybody has a mausoleum in their shop, don't they? No, it was, I mean, this is the funny thing with the story. It verges from being desperately, heartbreakingly tragic, just utterly awful, to being quite comical. You know, there are bits of it and the way he behaved that I laugh out loud. Funny, just an absolute nutter. And then the next minute you're hearing of the way that descended into real abuse.
Well, as we now know, this big, brash store, as he's now made it in his own image, with a big Egyptian hall and pushy salespeople, it does become the backdrop for something very dark. Just tell us, when you set out to do this book, did you have a sense of the scale of the number of people who had been affected by it? You know, give us a sense of what you knew and how big the problem turned out to be.
I had no idea it was going to be this big. I think we still think we don't know how big it was. I think there are so many women out there who were hurt by, and men. I mean, he didn't just hurt women. It was nasty to men as well. But we still, I don't think, have quite an idea of how many were hurt. But
how many do we know of?
Well, they're thinking around 300. I talked to a security guard as part of writing the book, a man who went under the name Biggie when I talked to him, and he thought it would be way more than that. He said everywhere he went, there will be bodies, meaning obviously people who were hurt by him. And I started out doing it because a couple of friends had said they'd been attacked by him when he died. And we'd talked about that. And I suppose I thought it might make a good newspaper article when they first told me. And then the BBC documentary aired, the Predator documentary, which showed what he'd been up to and the extent of it.
Scared. And he just pushed himself on top of me, but I'm strong, and I started kicking him, and I kicked him, and I kicked him, and I kicked him, and I kicked him off, and I kicked him really hard.
I thought he's going to rape me. Definitely thought he was going to rape me. I said, I just want to go to sleep on my own. Mr. Fayed, I don't want to, Mr. Fayed. And he kept saying, relax, please relax. How can you relax when you're in that situation?
So then I went back and realised a lot of the stories in the documentary were a similar MO to the two girls that I'd been talking to. And then another woman came forward with a similar story about how he'd attacked her. And everyone I talked to suggested someone else for me to talk to. So slowly it grew and it grew and grew and grew.
And just give us an idea, just a very quick sketch, really, of what that modus operandi was. I mean, how does he go about abusing women who work for him?
There were various strands, but they all sort of amount to the same thing, really. If he saw women, he did his shop walks every day. His grand store walks would take him all around the store under the pretence that he was going to meet customers and check everything was all right and just be part of the store life, day-to-day life. He would be looking out for young women who he found attractive, and he had a very distinct, a very clear picture of the sort of women he liked. They were tall, slim, blonde, very British looking, and with cut glass accents. And as worryingly, he had others with him who would be looking out for women like that. And there was one woman who would take Polaroid pictures of girls and have them hanging up. So if he wanted a girl, she could show him the girls on the store that he could pick from.
Oh, wow.
And this mainly happened on the perfume counter, which was known as the sweet shop, because he'd go and pick sweets.
That also starts to give you a sense that this isn't just him finding women. There is a system around it. There's an entire infrastructure.
He was paying a lot of people around him and giving free handbags and bundles of cash to people all around him who were assisting him. I think certainly some of them knew exactly what they were doing and what was happening to the women, without any doubt.
Tell us a bit about Liz and what happened to her.
Liz started working at the store, and she'd only been there for 2 or 3 weeks before Fayed approached her and wanted to talk to her about how she was getting on in the store. She said she was getting on fine. So she was called up to his rooms and asked whether she would make a video just saying how much she was enjoying her time at Harrods. Once he had her upstairs in his apartment, he raped her. She fled the apartment. I mean, there's a horrible part of when she was talking to me, when she thinks about it now, all she can remember is the blood dripping off her face onto the sheets. He had these white sheets, and feeling so anxious that he'd be cross that she got this blood onto his lovely, expensive sheets, and feeling the man had just raped her, but all she could feel was, he's going to get angry with me because I ruined his sheets. She went back down to the floor and kept herself, quietly got on with it, didn't tell anyone what had happened, which is what a lot of them do, because you have to remember that he was recording everything. There were cameras and there were tape recorders everywhere. Everywhere they went, there were recordings being done. And I think they were terrified to speak out. So she just got on with it with the rest of her day. And then she saw security guards walking across the floor. She was taken downstairs into the basement where they had what they called the cell, which he'd set up in order, he'd told people to put shoplifters until the police could come, but it was rarely used for that, as far as I was told. It was used for women who disobeyed Fayed, so they should put into this cell. And then she was told that she'd been caught stealing, and they produced her coat and said there was a bottle of perfume in it, and that they would call the police and that she would be arrested. The option was that they would take the perfume out, and if she kept quiet, they'd pay her £250, and she'd have to sign a non-disclosure agreement, and then she would be allowed to go. So his way of getting rid of people and having an NDA signed was to do this, to give them no option. The really awful thing that's also transpired is that if he had been confronted by her saying, no, I didn't steal this, I want to go to the police, he'd paid off police to do fake arrests on them.
Oh.
And then they would be really terrified and say, no, I've changed my mind, I'll sign the NDA.
That is horrifying.
Yeah.
And we'll get into some of that in a moment, just because there's his guilt, but there is clearly a whole lot of people who don't come out of this very well.
Yeah.
Just to show them, I mean, you were describing the MO, the way he went about this. You mentioned the perfume counter. This is a classic example with Liz. Tell us about somebody else you spoke to, Belinda, and how it progressed for her.
Yeah, with Belinda, this was, I was going to say one of the most awful stories, but they were all so awful in their own way. But I think Belinda perhaps was more affected than others by what happened to her. She was absolutely devastated. She was raped by Fayed and went back down to the floor to work, didn't plan to say anything to anyone. All she wanted to do was just go to work and go home again, like all these women, So she just kept out of his way. And then one day she realised that she hadn't had a period for a couple of months. So she went and she got a pregnancy test, did it, and it was positive. So she was absolutely terrified and thought, well, I'll go and talk to the Harrods doctor. And the doctor gave her a pregnancy test and said, yes, it shows that you are pregnant. Belinda burst into tears, was absolutely devastated by this because she in this awful position, and told the doctor what had happened, that she'd been raped by Fayed and didn't know what to do. And the doctor said she'd help her, but did nothing to help her at all because she informed Fayed about what had happened and put enormous pressure on Belinda to have an abortion and said to her, if you come back in tomorrow, we'll take you to an abortion clinic and get rid of it. Belinda was just sort of thrown by all this, needed time to think. So the next day she called in ill and went to meet a good friend of hers at a cafe near her home. And when she went to the cafe, she was confronted by 2 Harrods security guards who'd been parked outside her house that morning. They confronted her and said to her, you have to have an abortion. The next morning they came, they frog-marched her to an abortion clinic. They waited outside while she had the abortion and then frog-marched her back.
That's extraordinary.
And she was dismissed. And she has really suffered. I mean, it's appalling, isn't it? It's just, she never went on to have children, and I think she feels that the damage caused by that was, she hasn't had boyfriends and she's kept herself to herself, and she feels very lonely in later life. She had this awful thing she did where she scratched her hands constantly and there was blood everywhere. And I was slightly worried that I was not forcing her to relive it, but part of me talking to her was, but she said, no, I do this all the time. I think about it constantly. It's nice to be able to talk to someone else rather than have it in my head going round and round and round. And she hadn't spoken about it before. She hadn't talked to anyone. She just suffered in silence. That's what he did. That's what he did to these people.
Alison, he didn't only target members of staff. Tell us about the story of the daughter of the American ambassador to London.
This is a remarkable story. The ambassador came over to London and organised a dinner party. A very well-liked, very successful and professional man who is seen as one of the greatest ambassadors of all time, a man called Charles Price, whose daughter Melissa came to the dinner party, and he invited Fayed to it. Fayed was sitting next to her. Melissa was doing an art degree and talked about her love of art, so he suggested she might advise him on art that he could have either to sell in the store or to have up in the hotel in Paris, in the Ritz. And she thought this might be a fun thing to do. So she went to the Ritz in Paris with him, and immediately I think she felt an awkwardness. Things didn't feel quite right. And then he suggested that they go to his, he has a yacht moored in the south of France, and he suggested she come and look at the artwork he had in there. So they headed down there, and I mean, to all intents and purposes, he kidnapped her on the yacht. When she was on the yacht, he held her captive, he took her passport off her, and he attacked her. He grabbed her and was trying to fondle her and all the rest of it. So she bit his arm. And what's remarkable about this story, as well as many other things, is the fact that she was screaming for help. And there were security guards all around, but nobody came. And she really screamed. And when she bit him and he cried out, they all rushed in.
Wow. So they were used to ignoring.
They were used to ignoring the cries
screams
of
women.
Yeah. But once he was hurt, because he was what they were there, he was the one they were there to protect, which is astonishing, isn't it?
It really is. And again, it just gives you the sense of this entire infrastructure he'd built up that enabled this horrific behaviour.
I talked to psychologists who try to explain it, and they talked about this bystander theory where you can feel that you detach yourself because you're in a professional setting and your job is to look after this guy here, Fayed, and you don't see the damage he's causing because you're so one-tracked. Whichever way you look at it, though, you have to cut through it, don't you, and say, this is appalling behaviour, it's inhumane.
Just give us a sense of how many people are we talking about? How many people would have known? And sort of which jobs were they doing? I mean, you've mentioned security. doctors even?
Yes, the doctors were performing tests on the women. So once he saw someone that he was attracted to or wanted to move into his own personal office, they would move up and then be asked to go to the doctors for tests, medical tests, which they assumed to be blood pressure tests, maybe height and weight, things like that. And they were forced to have intimate tests, smear tests and various other tests. And a lot of the time then they'd go back to the store and Fayed would call them in and give them their results. So on one occasion, this woman walked in, he said, "You've got an infection, you need to take this," and gave her and she was appalled because she'd been, no one should see this.
No,
it's
you'd
absolutely
imagine that would
strictly
be
private. It's horrible, isn't it?
confidential.
Yeah. And I think when doctors aren't on your side, and when the police, as we've said, weren't on your side, it all starts to collapse a bit, doesn't it? Those two pillars that you expect society to be solid in a society, once they start collapsing and being bought by Fayed, the whole thing disintegrates.
And you mentioned security. They seem to have been complicit in some ways too. You actually spoke to one of them, Biggie, you mentioned him earlier. Tell us a bit about him. What was it like talking to him and what did he tell you?
He was a former soldier, like a lot of them were. They were either former soldiers or former police officers that were brought in by Fayed. I think he liked the fact that Biggie was big and strong and had been in Northern Ireland and, could fight anyone. So Biggie went to work for him and said that so much was expected of the security guards. I think he felt you lost touch with what you were doing. There was a guy there nicknamed Sherlock that was sent out to follow girls at weekends. So he might say to a girl or woman, "Do you have a boyfriend?" And if the girl said yes, he said, "Well, get rid of him and I'll give you a huge big job in my company." And then he'd send this guy Sherlock to follow the girl over the weekend to see whether she did have a boyfriend. And then that guy would report back to Biggie, who would pass the information on to John McNamara, who's the head of security. I mean, the idea of following a 16, 17-year-old for the weekend when she goes to the cinema with her boyfriend, you've got this guy.
She's in a relationship.
Yeah. So there was all that sort of surveillance going on. There was all the cameras in store. He talked me through, I mentioned the cell down in the basement. He talked me through the wall of screens that they were watching constantly and all the taping that went over. And
tell me about that, because it does sound like, you're used to walking into a shop and seeing security cameras, but this is a whole other level.
This is security cameras everywhere. This is security cameras in the ladies' toilets that the staff would go into so that when went in, they couldn't share information. They couldn't say what had happened to them.
Because there are microphones too.
Yeah,
you can hear everything.
Yeah, microphones everywhere. Fayed had his own flat very near to Harrods. So when he asked girls to stay late, he would offer them a chance to stay in some of these flats. They were all bugged. One woman told me about how she was lying on the bed with her legs up because her back was sore. So she put her legs up against the wall on the bed and was sort of stretching herself out. And her phone rang and it was him saying, "I like it when you lie like that with your legs in the air." It's hard to express how much everything was being bugged everywhere. Every single office in that building, every flat he owned, all the changing rooms and toilets and everywhere you went, in all the lifts. And that had the impact of dividing the women because they were scared to talk to one another and share stories. And maybe if 5 of them had said, "This is what happened to me," they would together have gone to the police. It could have had more impact. But when you're on your own and you're young and this has happened and you're just sitting terrified on your own, you're less of a threat, aren't you? You're less of an impact. And you're scared of the police because you know he's more powerful than the police because people keep telling you. Biggie said he spent a lot of time saying he's more powerful than the police, be careful.
And for Biggie, when you talk to him, how does he feel now about the things he was involved in?
Yeah, he kept saying that he didn't know, he didn't realise. He said, "But I didn't see it like that. I was just getting on with the job. I wasn't thinking about what was happening to other people." To be honest, I don't think he knew the extent of what was going on. I think he knew that Fayed was messing around with the girls, but he thought that girls were going in there willingly and he was giving them money and handbags in return for sex. He knew that something was going on, but I don't think he realised quite to the extent that they were being raped.
And yet he warned them that Al-Fayed was more powerful than the police.
He said to them, "Don't go to the police, it will backfire on you. He's more powerful than the police."
You've mentioned that before, but just explain what happened if girls went to the police.
Well, there was one occasion where a girl went to the police station. John McNamara was head of security for Harrods
and had Biggie's boss, effectively.
Biggie's boss, the guy who sort of put the whole security thing together. And they used to call him Mac the Knife, and he has a dreadful reputation. People sort of shake in their seats when you mention him to them now.
Really?
Yeah, really nasty man. I didn't interview him, he died years ago. But everything everyone said points to a man who was hell-bent on destruction and just do anything Fayed wanted. He had worked in the police at a very high level. So when it came to working with the police, he was able to access the police computers and find out anything he wanted. And one lady went to the police to report that she'd been attacked by him. The police rang McNamara, who drove to the police station. By the time she came out from having reported it, he was there. She walked straight into him and he said, "Go back in now and cancel that complaint, or you'll never hear the end of it. And I know where your parents live, I know where your brother and sister live." So she went back in and withdrew her complaint.
That is absolutely terrifying.
Yeah.
So the police, even when they are receiving complaints, they're either disappearing, the girls are going in and retracting them because they've been put under pressure,
Yeah.
or the police just aren't investigating at this stage.
Yeah, very much. That most of the complaints of the police didn't go any further. Those that did go to CPS were rejected because there was lack of evidence. People often say to me, why did they leave it till after he died before complaining? Why did no one complain? A lot did complain, a lot tried and didn't get anywhere.
And yet there were some repercussions for Al-Fayed, even while he was alive. You told us earlier about Melissa Price, the daughter of the American ambassador. Tell us what happened to her after the attack on the boat.
Yeah, she left and came back. Obviously, she has disappeared and her father's the ambassador. So there's a certain amount of concern about this girl suddenly disappearing, and people were asking questions and trying to locate her. He rang Harrods and asked where his daughter was, and he was told that she was in meetings and being unavailable and she'd be back very soon. So once she'd attacked Fayed, she was put into a boat and taken to shore. And incidentally, as her boat left to take her to shore, another boat came in with a attractive blonde girl in it. So he was swapping them over. So she arrived back and went back home and told her father what had happened. And he told Margaret Thatcher and he told government ministers. Reagan was also told. It was, a big incident. The Queen was told. This was all going on. So nothing happened to him. There was no court case because of it. There was no
She didn't
issue,
want to go to the police.
She didn't want to go to the police. She was strongly advised by her father not to go to the police. I think it's a very difficult position, isn't it, if your father's the ambassador, how to play it.
Yeah, becomes very public.
Yeah. So they kept it under the radar.
And yet
but
they did have influence.
They had influence, and she feels very strongly that's why he never got citizenship, which was something he craved. Fayed, throughout his life, wanted British citizenship and applied lots of times and was rejected lots of times. Never actually got citizenship.
You think this is fair from the Home Secretary to behave the way with someone like me who have given employments to thousands of people, having 4 British kids? It shows what type of people infiltrate in the political life and give us such a deal.
You like to think, don't you, that the one thing he absolutely was desperate for never happened because of this. But you also wish he was alive now to see this and to stand there with all these problems and issues and stories about him raining down on him. You'd love to see him sort of have to face it.
And for some sense of justice.
Yeah, very much so, which would help those who've been hurt by him enormously, I think.
It is coming back to Harrods just because so much of this story does feel like it's, there's a system in place, or there was back then, that enabled all of this. Harrods is now trying to deal with the problem. Just tell us what they're trying to do and what they're saying about it.
The Harrods of today has got nothing to do with Fayed. Obviously, he sold it and it's now run very differently, nothing to do with the Fayed family at all. And they've been clear that they are appalled by the allegations of abuse. They have emphasised that none of this took place with their ownership, and they're very clear that they want to separate themselves from it. Harrods have set up a fund for the victims and are planning to, once they've been through all the evidence they have and once they've got all the claims in, they'll be looking to give cash payments to those who suffered from Fayed. There's also talk about the Fayed family having to give funds to those who suffered. So that's in the ether, that's going to happen, which hopefully sooner rather than later. Sometimes people can wait years and years and years for compensation, can't they?
Yeah.
But it's compensation, it's money, and they should absolutely have it. But it's not, what compensation can you have for someone like Belinda that was raped and forced to have an abortion? How do you compensate for that? How can you possibly make that right?
A lifetime of distress that followed.
Yes. She said it destroyed me. And even today, you're talking 20 years later, she's still struggling to talk about it and crying. And I don't know how you ever compensate for that. But then I suppose they would argue that how do you? All we can do is give money. And I think they should, absolutely. And the Fayed family should.
People will have heard of some of the stories of abuse around Harrods, even before your book came out. I mean, your book does an amazing job of just recording the scale and telling some of the stories that hadn't been heard before. It also, though, really alarmingly highlights that it wasn't just Harrods. I mean, his attention moved on. Tell us about Westheath School.
Yeah, this is horrific. So Westheath School is Princess Diana's old school, and it was running into financial difficulties. So after her death in 1997, he bought Westheath School, which had been turned into a school for troubled children who needed help and needed support, and began to run it with no experience of running schools. And it made a big drama and glamour out of it. He flew Madonna over for one of the functions they were holding there, and he would sort of turn up there formally. But what I discovered through the investigations was he would also turn up there informally, and he would go into the school, wander around the playgrounds, wander around and talk to people. I managed to track down 2 members of staff at the school, one teacher and one member of staff who wasn't a member of the teaching staff. And the teacher said that he became alarmed at how frequently Fayed would come and walk around the playground, talk to the children. And he said that's something the parents can't do. You can't just walk into a school. But he was allowed to because he owned it. He'd saved the school. The school was going to close. So he'd wander around and talk to these children. And then he heard stories about them being taken off to swimming and taken off to Harrods and given gifts and lifts in his Rolls Royce and his planes and all the rest of it, and became very worried. And then a girl came to him and said that she'd been attacked by Fayed. She came to see this teacher who referred her to the other member of staff that I talked to, a female, and told her that she'd been attacked and her friend had as well. Turned out her friend had been raped. And so it developed into the fact that he was going into this school and giving them gifts and taking them off and going into their bedrooms, taking them to Harrods and showing them around and abusing them.
Westheath School issued its only comments on the allegations, saying, "We have no further information other than what's currently in the news," adding, "We do not tolerate abuse or harassment in any form." And Alison's requests for information have been met with a referral to those statements. And just finally, you spoke to so many women who'd been affected. Many of them were attacked decades ago. How are they now?
I don't think any of them were attacked and just moved on. I think everyone who was attacked like that at a young and vulnerable age has been affected by it, some more than others. Some were more severely hurt than others. Some have really struggled. There was a certain amount of shame associated with it, which is, you can understand, but you feel really frustrated because there's only one person who should be ashamed in all this. But they felt ashamed that they put themselves in that position or that they didn't call it out at the time. But a lot of them are only learning now what happened. They thought they were an isolated case, and they're suddenly realising, oh gosh, when I went to the doctors and was forced to have a smear test, it was part of the Fayed's campaign. They hadn't realised till they saw the BBC's documentary or heard my stories about other people. So for a lot of them, it's ongoing, and they're only now realising the extent of it. I think a lot of them have got together now and feel huge support in each other. But it's not the sort of thing that just goes away, is it? It's the sort of thing that lingers and causes you lifelong trauma. The whole thing's not over. The book's only just come out, and I've had calls and messages from other people who've been attacked by him, wanting to share their stories. From people who witnessed incidents and people who were hurt by him, who had kept quiet and thought that they wished they'd spoken out and called me to tell me their stories. So the thing goes on, and I can't imagine how many there are out there.
That was Alison Kervin, and her new book, The Monster of Harrods, Al-Fayed and the Secret Shameful History of a British Institution, is out now, and you can read more about it at thetimes.com. To protect the identities of the victims we've talked about, their names have been changed in this episode. If you've been affected by the issues we've discussed today, then you can get in touch with the Rape and Sexual Abuse Support Line 24 hours a day on 0808 500 2222. You can also visit the website 247sexualabusesupport.org.uk. That's 247sexualabusesupport.org.uk to speak to somebody online. The producer today was Edith Russello, the executive producer was Molly Guinness, and sound design and theme composition were by Maula Seto. Thanks for listening. We'll be back soon.